Welcome to the Heart Rate Variability Podcast. In this podcast, we discuss the exciting science behind HRV and how you can apply it to your own health and the work that you do. Just a note, this podcast does not replace medical advice, and if you're going to apply this to your own life or others, please consult with a medical provider. Thank you and enjoy the show.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Heart Rate Variability Podcast. This is Jeff Summers here with my good friend and business partner, Matt Bennett.
Hey, Jeff.
Hey, Matt. How are you doing?
Just got back from my first in-person training trip in 6 months. So
6 months. And
had a great time.
Canyon
City's, a little mountain town here, and not mid-size, I would say, for mountain towns. I've been down there. This was my fourth trip, so I have some good friends. You'll appreciate this, Jeff. Talked to two Rotary clubs. Rotary is kind of like the Lions Club, but what they call themselves are Rotarians, which
I did not know that.
Them in my book a lot cooler because it's kind of Lord of the Rings. Like, I might want to be a Rotarian, I was on AM radio and did a training for early childhood educators. So it was a good trip. We got a little snow, so that put some snow on the mountains. But it's been an odd
earliest. That's right. Second earliest snow in Denver history.
I watched my HRV weirdly with the pressure change drop.
It did, didn't it? I noticed that a little bit too. That and a couple unfortunate nights of sleep.
Kids home, yeah.
But, that's the way it works. So what was it like meeting with people in person during times of COVID?
Yeah, I mean, it's I've been pretty isolated, and just because of not everybody went in-person training. My wife and I have been trying to save as much money as we can. So I've had pretty much zero social life unless you invite me to hang out on your porch. I've been pretty isolated. So it was really great to see people face to face and talk to people, and also weird. I think as a kind of a public health guy, I'm always thinking, is this safe to do? And so it was kind of weird, but they did a good job of social distancing, wearing masks, and so I think, but it was just good to be back on the road and seeing people again. So
that's it, man. Exactly.
Yeah.
So we're on to episode 7. We've talked about a lot of good things. Got into sort of the tags and how it relates to individuals, their activities, and how those impact HRV. And I think we teased a little bit getting your career expertise in trauma.
Yes.
And relating it to HRV and how HRV can be a tool for trauma-informed care. So I think it's probably best to start just with a definition of trauma from your perspective, because there's a lot of folks who know very well because they follow your work.
Yeah.
There's also hopefully a lot of folks listening to this that don't. And so I think it would be good for them to understand when we say trauma, what does that mean?
Yeah, so let me give you a few definitions. And whenever I talk about trauma, I just want to warn, because statistically we know the majority of our readers have experienced trauma in their own life. So if this hits close to home, my job, I always see it, is to keep this upbeat, because there's a lot of hope around trauma. The better we understand it, hopefully it builds reasons why to seek treatment and get help. But I always just like to put out that warning when you talk about trauma. You're always talking about the worst things that happen to human beings. So just what we call in the field a trigger warning there for folks before we start this episode. We'll make it as safe as possible for you. So Jeff, there's kind of 3 definitions I want to throw out, and I'll kind of relate them to HRV once we get these definitions out there. The first one I like to call episodic trauma or traumatic event. And this is something big that happens. And I kind of like, my informal definition is that if you're an outsider and you witness someone going through this experience, you would say, hey, there's a high likelihood this would be traumatic for this individual. So, this can be something like an automobile accident. I know as we record this, there's fires, there's floods, there's a pandemic going on. So, losing, I used to live up in the mountains, and I know what fire season is like. up there and being evacuated and, watching some of those, we have a loss of life, but also loss of property and all these things going on in California, Colorado, and just basically the Western United States. So things like that. Also, when we think about trauma, especially in childhood, we can talk about, emotional, sexual, physical abuse, neglect. We also see a lot of things, disruptions to the home, everything from divorce to alcoholism, incarceration, mental illness in the home, domestic violence, those sort of things as well. So a traumatic event, what it does underneath the skin is it really overwhelms our nervous system's ability to cope. I always like to say, like, if you can go through a very stressful event and you can get a good night's sleep and maybe go for a run and feel better and you're back to your normal self the next day, that's stress. Trauma really puts us in a fight, flight, freeze, or shutdown mode for a period of time. Now, it doesn't mean this period of time needs to last 20 years. I know a lot of people who've gone through trauma who, they get support from family, friends, maybe mental health treatment, maybe not. But, they might be down for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, but maybe 3 weeks after whatever happens, they're back to work. They may only be 80%, but they're sort of back in that swing of normal life. And give them a month or two and they're pretty much kind of back on their feet and back to kind of that normal functioning. So that's, when we look at traumatic event, just overwhelms our ability to take a deep breath, keep ourselves regulated. We go into fight, flight, and freeze. And no matter who you are, there's a level of stress that will put us in that mode. The second definition I went through is something called chronic trauma. And this is something that's less talked about, but so important. Jeff, one of the reasons I really got thinking about this is, working in homelessness, you might meet somebody who's been living out in the streets for 15 years and you meet them on a normal Tuesday and you wouldn't look at them and say they're going through a traumatic event right now, right? This is their typical Tuesday, waking up in a shelter, going to the food bank, soup kitchen, whatever it is to get food, hanging out in the park, whatever it might be. In many ways, it's their normal, but their normal is under such a high level of stress that it also really wrecks and changes how our nervous system functions and operates as well. So, another thing I've worked with a lot of vets over the years, and I've just come to appreciate deployment is, you imagine, I think Jeff and I, it's probably hard for either you or I to imagine what this would even be like, but imagine being in the back of a armored vehicle rolling through Afghanistan or Iraq and not knowing if there's, a roadside bomb or a sniper. And, even if you go through that activity, that mission and nothing happens, boy, if you're worried about your life for 2-3 hours at a time and that becomes a daily activity, again, that there may not be like the bomb going off, but we know that also really disrupts the health of our nervous system as well. The other term I want to throw out there is something called complex or compound trauma. And this is really, when we talk about trauma being something people struggle with for years, for the most part, this is what we're talking about. This is sort of a combination of traumas where, you might be in that deployment and there may be, again, every day is highly stressful, maybe a level of stress you and I have hardly ever felt in our lives. But then something traumatic does happen. Maybe one of their friends gets seriously hurt and injured. Something big happens, a bomb does go off, those sort of things. So a lot of times when we see people struggling, when I worked with kids from dangerous neighborhoods, they had that danger was always present, but then one of their friends got shot. So they had these chronic traumas with these episodic or traumatic events mixed in. And so the research on trauma has really shown how kids are especially vulnerable because their nervous systems are rapidly developing. It's amazing when you look at the statistics about how many neurons they're creating or losing and how those neurons connect. They're just so vulnerable and their nervous system can structure very quickly around trauma. And so a lot of kids that I worked with in child welfare, juvenile justice, all of them really came out of this compound complex trauma. And pretty much everybody that I've run into, statistically, there might be the exception to the rule. I just haven't found them. You know, everybody I've talked to that has spent time in a homeless shelter or our prison systems, substance abuse addiction also has come from a history of trauma as well. Again, there's exceptions to the rule, but they never made my caseload, so to speak. So again, whether it's an event that overwhelms us and puts us in survival mode, or it's that constant stress that kind of always keeps us in fight, flight, or freeze, trauma overwhelms our ability to cope and stay healthy over time.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so that's a lot, right? And so using the word, stress in that definitions of the various types of trauma people are exposed to. And so that's sort of the natural entry point into where HRV fits in and how it can help, treat, identify, all in past episodes. So I think it's good to sort of relate the two together,
Absolutely. And so let me come up here with a couple different definitions. So first, again, heart rate variability, if you've listened to the episodes leading up to this, if not, it probably would be good because I don't want to go back and explain everything. But really what we're measuring, again, is your body's ability to handle or recover from stress. Now, trauma, if you just want a real simple definition, is an overwhelmingly intense amount of stress. So we can look at this in a few different ways. One is, what does trauma do to HRV? It crashes it, right? So most of the time, and we sort of have this leveled response we've also talked about, is when we feel safe, we're in the ventral vagal part of our autonomic nervous system. So it's highly connected to our face or in our heart. So what happens when we're in a healthy state is we have this thing called the ventral vagal brake. So every time we inhale, we activate kind of the sympathetic, which I'll talk about here in a second, which raises our heart rate. The exhale, that ventral brake calms it down, which is where we get that variability with heart rate. When we enter trauma, when we experience trauma, we drop out of there to, usually for most people, we'll go first into the flight response. So we'll try to escape the trauma. This is why, another reason why childhood trauma is so devastating, because a lot of times, especially in abusive homes, the kids just can't escape. And so we'll try to run away, but if we can't run away, we'll try to fight back. So we'll usually go flight first, then fight. And if neither of those gets the stress out of our life or our situation, we'll drop into our dorsal vagal, which is in our gut area, and that will do the shutdown or freeze response. So then we become comatose. We can even, in the extremes, detach from reality. We call this disassociation in psychology. It's a coping skill. I had a neurobiologist tell me, I was asking him about this after going to a training. He's like, just imagine if you're an early human being and a saber-toothed tiger is going to eat you, Jeff. It is really good to be disconnected from reality. So one, right, it's a really good survival technique, because if the tiger thinks you're dead, it might not eat you. If the tiger's going to eat you, it's kind of nice not to experience every bit of that horrific into your life. So our body is so well equipped to deal with this. But so when we go into trauma, again, usually that sympathetic reaction, we will see a great increase in heart rate. Once we go in the sympathetic system, that vagal brake will pull off. So we'll just see this escalation in heart rate and limitation in variability. When we go into the freeze response, something interesting happens is our heart rate will drop. We almost enter this comatose-like state, but the variability is not high either. So it's a very kind of steady, even though it's a much slower heart rate and heart rate variability. So it's a little bit more rare, but we do see that at times as well. So again, trauma happens under intense stress. We see that our body's not able to handle or recover. Again, our working definition of HRV. So we see really significant drops. Now, if you're looking at HRV and how do you know if somebody's experiencing trauma or not, because there's a lot of things, and you and I, having taken readings for quite a while now, can do this is, if you looked at one of my readings, you might say, "Ooh, this guy's in trouble." He's usually around, in the high 40s. He's a 15 today. Doesn't mean I'm going through a traumatic experience. Now, if you see me 15, 10, 8, 11, right? So if I'm having those readings for multiple days, something different's going on. My nervous system may have lost its ability to recover. So usually what we see with trauma is it's a drop for several days, maybe several weeks. Potentially if somebody, and again, if you think about that complex or compound trauma and that constant pressure on folks, we can see that people coming into services with a history of trauma, their heart rate variability oftentimes, most often, is going to be well below the population norms for their age and gender. So this is what we expect. We're doing some work with some homeless providers, looking at that data, collecting it. But what we see is, really low, especially compared to those population norms as well. So really, trauma is going to, in the short term, do big drops. Now, if we don't get treatment and support, the thing that's risky about trauma is it can stay low. So we see kids that experience trauma really throughout childhood. If they don't get the help they need, then their nervous systems start to develop around that stress and trauma. So those kids that I worked with growing up in neighborhoods with gang violence, that was their life from the day they were born till when they got arrested and came into my program. Their HRV very low, because that fight response, always being on the edge of the fight or flight, was how they survived their walk to school, how they survived walking. And a lot of my kids then joined gangs. And, if there's a drive-by shooting, you don't want to stand there and cognitively think about your best response. You want to run like, what. So, what we see again with histories of trauma, we see people with that low HRV coming into services as well. Also, something we've talked about that show, you throw substances on top of that, it can even lower it further. So a lot of folks with, not everybody, but a lot of folks with substance abuse struggles, we know that trauma is also a part of their life history as well. We know that anywhere from 5, 10, I've seen huge numbers where, trauma puts you at greater risk for addiction as well.
Yeah, that's powerful stuff, man. So, you talked about how obviously, and just sort of thinking about some of the therapists and clinicians that might be listening, you talk about how a lot of the folks that they're going to be working with are just sort of innately, due to the experiences that they've been through, going to have a lower than average HRV coming in. So, how do you use it as a tool to help and provide better care and sort of monitor the activities and the interventions that you're applying in the day-to-day treatment to know that things are working?
That's a great question. So there's this, why I love talking about this is not because I love talking about trauma. That would say something pretty disturbing about me. Why I love talking about this is the concept of post-traumatic growth. So trauma heals in a different way than other kind of injuries to our biology. If you break your arm and you get treatment and your arm goes back to where it was before the injury, you're probably really happy with your care, right? You're probably going to write your doctor a thank you note, give them a high rating on your patient satisfaction score, and go on with your life because you're back to where you started. The great thing about trauma is we don't usually go back to a previous state, so to speak. If we get the ability to heal from trauma, and for those that might not be as familiar with the trauma literature, there's amazing best practices out there now. Psychology is in this golden age of we've got a lot of great ways to help people heal from trauma. So if I get the help that I need, the support I need, the love I need, the treatment I need, what we see is when trauma heals, part of that healing process, not only are we resetting the nervous system, we're gaining wisdom and strength from that recovery process. As a survivor of childhood trauma myself, I can say with all my being is I never want to go back and experience anything like that ever again. However, I'm stronger today because I was able to overcome that experience. I have a resiliency that I don't know if I'd have that if I hadn't gone through that hard part. In other words, life threw that at me. Life can throw a pandemic at me, right? It might knock me on my butt a few days a week, but hey, I'm gonna get back up and I'm gonna fight. So we get this strength, wisdom from that experience, confidence, self-efficacy from that experience. Now, from the HRV perspective, what I got really excited about and why I wanted to bring this to the nonprofit world as well as others is, as we talk about, people come in with a lower than average HRV score. So body is probably, for a lot of folks, if they're in the complex compound trauma for a substantial period of time, really having trouble handling, adjusting distress. Maybe never really having that recovery, continuing to feel the psychological pain, suffering of the event, even if maybe the physical wounds have healed, the psychological ones, as mirrored by our nervous systems, are still there. So what I did and why, titled the book Using Biometrics to Improve Outcomes in Trauma-Informed Organizations, is really looking at, okay, we know folks are going to come in under their population norms. There might be exceptions to the rule. That's one thing I'm interested in when our data set gets big enough to say, hey, is that assumption right? Because, it should be because of the studies we've seen, but I'm excited to get enough information to share that with folks. But what we really want to do, no matter where somebody comes in, because we've talked about the genetic factors that can play into this, the goal of services is helping people improve their HRV scores over time. So if your intervention is working, if your program is working, if your psychotropic medications are working, what you should see is that the nervous system starts to heal. And you got, you can label, I think we're okay to label that resiliency. You're building resiliency. You're building strength. What you're doing from a nerdy perspective is that vagal brake is gaining strength. So now we see, that's why we see, granted, sympathetic inhale, heart rate speeds up, but I'm building that emotionally regulated vagal brake to bring it down. Now, when we start to do that, some pretty cool things happen. We know the ventral vagal is really empowering for our social interactions. We talked about so much of our communication happens with the area. This is great at a time of a pandemic because I can just say that's covered by the mask, right? So the ventral vagal is really connected all throughout here because that's how we express ourselves and our emotions to other people. We see also a connection to prefrontal cortex, which we know that thinking part of our brain, the part of the brain responsible for emotional regulation. As we go through a post-traumatic growth trauma, will actually, especially the complex compound trauma in childhood, we can actually measure through functional MRIs that the prefrontal cortex getting smaller. So, as heart rate variability starts to improve, we also see with functional MRIs that prefrontal cortex is more active, so it lights up more, but also gaining strength and size, also calming down the amygdala, which is physically larger in people with untreated trauma. As we do practice things like mindfulness, as we gather people around us who love us and help us co-regulate, we see the amygdala can go back and shrink in size as well. So we start to see that HRV also shows larger changes in our neurobiology that are impacted by trauma too. Now, if you want to bring a functional MRI into your program's work, you better write a grant. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars, techs to do it, PhDs to interpret. Whereas why I just couldn't let HRV go and why we took this journey is, for less than $1 a day, you can track an individual's HRV score. So this is the exciting thing. And I think I could make an argument. I don't think it's probably worth making, but I'd make the argument because the changes are so microscopic on the functional MRIs, the heart rate variability is actually the best way to track post-traumatic growth. And again, the cost is a lot more doable. And if you've ever been in a functional MRI, you need a room, you just need a whole lot of things. So I always wanted, as a therapist, I felt like I was treating organs that I never got to see. And HRV really, it's like, for me, like when a doctor looks at your broken leg, they get an x-ray. Now I get the health of your nervous system. And when I do interventions, I can track whether it's having a positive or negative effect on the health of the nervous system, which obviously the brain sits on top of that sucker. So gives us great insight to what's going on underneath the skin.
No, it's great feedback. And, you know, I think this topic is pretty focused on folks within sort of the helping world, you know, therapists, nurses, doctors, clinicians, you know, all of those kind of counselors, all those kind of folks, you know, but for the other folks that are listening, I mean, I still think this is very valuable information, you know, and especially as you're working with your employees, yourself, your family, whatever, and you can be surprised by a lower than average population score. You might look at somebody and say, wow, they look super fit, they seem to eat well, you know, why in the world would they be so much lower than the population average? And you know, these are good ways to explain what would look like an anomaly that might not otherwise be obvious to folks.
Yep, absolutely. And having employee assistance programs available, you know, those sort of things can be really supportive. We don't think of mental health trauma treatment as kind of the Woody Allen psychoanalysis where you need 40, 50, 60 years and you're still pretty screwed up. You know, 6, 10, 12 sessions, depending on what the trauma is, can be enough. Also, just a note out there, you know, if you've experienced trauma, getting, you know, there's an eye movement therapist, EMDR is what kind of the initials it goes by now, and other ones that, hey, we can, before that really trauma sinks in to your nervous system, we can kind of get that out. And even if it's been sunk in for a while, it might take a little longer, but we've got some great interventions now where you don't even have to tell your therapist about your trauma. You're going to think about it, and they're going to create a safe place for it to get out of your nervous system. I mean, it's really therapy, psychology, as I like to say, it's gotten really cool in the latest years. When I was trained, it was really boring. It was just two people sitting across talking with each other. Now we're activating different sides of the brain through tapping, eye movement, sounds. You know, we're really integrating science into this. And I'm excited that we can add HRV to that scientific movement where we're kind of taking a big step from being an art of therapy, which there'll always be some art to it, to more of a scientific approach where we can get you in and out. Jeff, the other thing I just want to mention about work environments as well, because I know that enterprise solution is a big part of what we do too, is you know, I think a lot of times, and I've been guilty of this, if something happens at work, it's not traumatic. It's part of your job. But you know, I've talked to so many people. I saw a statistic that I use in my leadership trainings. 1/4 of us have been bullied at work, you know, and I haven't gone through this, but I've seen coworkers bullied at work. It's traumatic. I did go through an organization who went through layoffs, and I was one of the people laid off.
I was going to say, I mean, times right now with COVID, there are a lot of folks out unexpectedly looking for jobs, and the family to support, that's traumatic.
Absolutely. And so, you know, a lot of times I think we like, oh, trauma can't happen at work. You know, maybe somebody walks in with a gun or something that obvious. Yeah. But layoffs, being fired, being bullied. I've seen people, and when I got laid off, I worked for a horrible organization. So I was kind of beat up already and then got laid off. I had post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, I had to really learn about trauma before I understood it. And I don't think I was ready to admit I was traumatized because I didn't want to give like my employer that kind of power over me. But I just went through hell. And as somebody who cares about being a great employee and the work that I do, it was a personal hit. That was one of the more difficult things I've ever been through in my life. And so, you know, I think sometimes we just assume that trauma happens outside the work environment. But you know, even the people, if an organization goes through layoffs and they weren't laid off, there's survivor guilt and there's a whole lot of other things as well. So this can help measure that. If you're in an organization, what about the staff that are left over? If you do have to lay people out, how are your staff coping with COVID or other disruptive events? And will everything rise to the level of trauma? No. Will everybody laid off experience a trauma? No. But this can really help support organizational wellness against these really hard times that we're going through right now. And I think that this can hopefully be a huge tool where there's a really immediate return on investment of seeing increases in productivity, decreases in turnover, and other things as well.
Yep. No, I'm glad you brought that up, because, when you and I talk about this sort of offline conversation often steers away from that, but it's very true. You think about harassment takes place in work. There's all kinds of things that can be traumatic that, people need to know about, and they need to understand, and they need to have the tools to address. And this is just another one of those tools.
Absolutely. And you just think about our healthcare essential workers right now. You start to talk about chronic trauma.
Sure.
They're going to work, they're working their shift, they're working double shifts. They're, I'm
exposed to everything.
Yeah. And I'm like telling the clinics, it's like, you need to triage paid time off right now. Like however you can do it, because these folks are one, they're putting as a husband of an educator with the school that's opening, they're trying to do it safely, but there's just an inherent risk to going back. And, I'm worried about my wife is incredibly healthy, but I'm worried, right? I don't, I'm worried about her kids and all that as well. And so, there is this, under this, and I'm just afraid with our healthcare workers, our essential workers who have been warriors throughout this thing, this can manifest as a chronic trauma and really destroy people's short-term and long-term health, because one of the things intense stress does that we've talked about a lot really inhibits immune system functioning. So if you don't handle stress well, now you're not only is your nervous system body struggling with stress, now you're also more susceptible to getting COVID or the flu and COVID, and God knows what these winter months in our hemisphere are going to bring. So, this is real. This is real. And just maybe a kind of a final note, if I can, to wrap up is, the other thing I think interesting with the connection between trauma and HRV is we see, as we've talked about, that HRV predicts 9 out of 10 of the leading causes of death in the United States. We know trauma also is a big, not only do we see the mental health issues, but we also are now seeing much higher rates of cancer, diabetes, heart disease, lung disease, liver disease. Some of that can be contributed to drug use, but not all of it, because when we're under that intense stress, again, our nervous system is struggling to function, and if you're living under that for decades, as many people do, we know it can take 20 years off your life. So, this is why treatment is so key, because we can cure it. There's a lot of hope out there. I challenge people. It's like, give me a situation where I would say this person, we should just give up on them, because you can't do it. Because I've seen people living out on the streets with severe addictions for 20, 30 years, change their life. And now they're working in homeless services, providing services to others who are in that dark spot. So, I've had that lived experience of knowing people that have had these journeys. So, there's so much risk if we don't get that treatment, which is one of the reasons a lot of us are out there really trying to get the stigma of mental health out of our society. Because, if you think you're weak or whatever it is, if you're sick, you will go to a doctor, right? And usually we're not responsible. Very few people, you'd have to really challenge me to find out a situation that somebody wanted to experience trauma, that somebody deserved trauma. Don't think it exists. No. So something happened to you. You might have got a virus. You might have experienced abuse, neglect, hurt, harm, and accident. Get the help you need, right? So that nervous system operates functionally, so you can thrive and enjoy life as much as possible.
Oh, that's right. And as you said, a really high percentage of people have been through this stuff. And it's the majority, not the minority. So there shouldn't be any sort of stigma around it at all.
Right. There's not. And the younger generation is going to kick our butt if we don't get to it. I mean,
That's good.
we're seeing it in Denver, Jeff. Like our Denver public school students are standing up and, saying, no, we need more mental health therapy. That's what we need. Do you want to know what we need? Are you going to ask us? We need more mental health there. One counselor per 500 kids, not enough. And, so the youth are saying, we need more of this. So maybe old folks like me, we've done some of our work. So I'm not giving up on us yet. But this younger generation seems to get it in a way. But again, no matter how old you are, don't stigmatize that. Go in. Right. If your first therapist you don't connect with, that's okay. Right? You didn't usually marry the person you dated for the first time. So if you don't feel okay with that person, you might have to check out 2 or 3, but again, that little investment in yourself can pay off in a much longer, happier, healthier life.
Yep. Excellent. A lot of good info. Definitely a heavy topic, but one that is very important to talk about. And I know a lot of the folks that are following your work, I think, are really going to be interested in the correlation between HRV and trauma. So thank you for that. And for the folks who maybe are listening for the first time, as Matt mentioned, his new book, Heart Rate Variability, Using Biometrics to Improve Outcomes in Trauma-Informed Organizations, is available for free on our website at optimalhrv.com. Folks interested in learning more about what we do for your organizations, feel free to reach out via the website as well. We'd love to help you understand what we're doing with other people to provide better care and better services to their clients and employees and everybody else. So what are we going to talk about next week, Matt? What's on the agenda?
What are we talking about? Wow, Jeff, asking these
I put you on the spot, man.
I'm going to give you an answer, though. We are going to look at HRV integration. So we're going to talk about this from a couple of different perspectives of, how would you integrate this into your organization? I think going from that perspective, we'll touch on if you are in the helping healing professions, how you might do this with clients. But I want to focus for our general audience on, okay, we've had, I think this is episode 7. We've had 7 to create this baseline. Now let's talk about what this might look like in a practical way. So how do we take these little monitors we have all over our house and use them to measure the health and well-being of either those we're serving or our own staff and organization?
Excellent. Looking forward to it. Well, thanks again, Matt. Always a lot of fun.
All right. Love it, Jeff.
All right. Have a great weekend. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate you coming along on the journey with us.
Thanks. Thank you for joining us for this episode. If you're interested in more information about HRV, please visit us at optimalhrv.com. Also, if you visit optimalhrv.com, you'll be able to sign up for our email list and download our free ebook, Healing with HRV. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next episode.